Welcome to this podcast, where we dive into critical social issues from a global perspective. Today, we are exploring an urgent and sensitive topic, domestic violence against women, comparing its impact, challenges, and resources available in Ecuador and the United States. While domestic violence is a pervasive issue worldwide, each country has its unique context, shaped by culture, laws, economic factors, and support systems. In Ecuador, a country where nearly 7 out of 10 women report experiencing some form of gender-based violence, limited resources and cultural stigmas can create significant barriers for women seeking help. Meanwhile, in the U.S., while there may be more legal protections and resources, high rates of violence persist, and issues like systemic inequality and access to services play a crucial role. Today's episode brings together voices from both countries, shedding light on the reality of domestic violence and exploring potential paths towards meaningful change.
I don't know if you can tell me, how laws that protect women work in each state that you are in, where you were from.
Do you want to go first?
Well, honestly, I don't know anything about laws. I know with regards to abortion, I was going to say Ohio. Chicago is very open with abortion. Like, anyone, obviously there's a certain period before you can get an abortion. But you definitely could get an abortion. With violence against women, I think I want to kind of generalize, but maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like most states do have pretty strict rules about violence against women and children.
A lot of Republican majority states have been increasing the strictness of the laws, or determining when you can and can't have an abortion. It's getting really nitpicky. So I know that I've heard of a couple of cases in North and South Carolina and Georgia, where women are going in for not even for abortions, but for pregnancy related illnesses or that kind of thing, where you could basically die if you don't get an abortion, and that doctors legally aren't allowed to give them that care because of those laws. But I just Googled because I wanted to make sure. In California, it looks like right now it's totally legal. And this even says from the County of Los Angeles Public Health, which is where I live, you can obtain an abortion in California regardless of age, immigration status, or whether you live inside or outside of the state. So it is really interesting. I think it depends a lot on the majority political party in the state, especially with the presidential election happening, which is happening tonight. That I think a lot of that stuff is becoming a huge talking point for people. So it'll probably, and they overturned Roe v. Wade. When was that?
Roe v. Wade?
22? Or was that even longer ago? That was the constitutional right to an abortion. And it was overturned by the Supreme Court.
So,
but when was it overturned?
Current status.
But that's why, 22. It says 2 years ago.
The federal right to abortion.
So over those 2 years, a lot of those laws have been changing. And yeah, I think there's laws too about you can be criminally prosecuted in some states for if you leave that state to get an abortion somewhere else. You can be prosecuted for that if I don't know who would find that out and how they would do that, but I'm honestly not well versed in other laws though, in terms of because I know that the article that you sent, the English article, was talking a lot about specific legal protections for femicide, and whether or not the prosecutors call, like, a murder femicide or not. That I feel like that was really interesting, because I don't know that we have that, or I've never heard of a law that, like, specifically distinguishes, like, a murder as being, like... Aureli's finding something.
Yeah, I was just looking for Illinois. There's a bunch of, like, acts. There's the Violence Against Women Act, and, like, with sexual assault programs and, like, arrest programs. Yeah, and there's help for women who have been, like, assaulted and everything else. Like, there's funds for them. It's called the VAWA program. And it's just, like, allocating funds and resources to those women who are victims of sexual or domestic assault and violence.
Okay.
There's also Title IX.
Yeah, Title IX. Is that just, like, in general? Or?
Title IX is an amendment that prohibits discrimination against, or, like, on the basis of sex in educational and athletic programs.
Okay.
So it's a super relevant thing, I think, in schools. At least, I mean, it's really relevant at Kenyon. That you can report people for discriminating or harassing on the basis of, I think it's not just sex, though. I think it's, like,
it's, like, discrimination,
race, gender identity,
domestic violence,
yeah,
harassment, stalking,
yeah,
etc.
And it's not specifically, I don't think, at least now, it's not specifically for women, but I would imagine that it was started for women.
Okay, so, like, when I was reading about this whole topic, I could tell that there was a really big difference between the US and Ecuador regarding domestic violence. So, for example, 7 out of 10 women in Ecuador have experienced sexual assault or sexual violence, whereas in the US, 1 in 10 women have experienced sexual assault or sexual violence. So there's, like, a huge difference between both countries. Here in Ecuador, I feel that a lot of the cases go unreported because of, like, this feeling of shame, or maybe like the prejudice that exists towards people that have suffered that. I don't know if there's any type of, like, cultural aspect, or, like, what is the perception towards victims of of domestic violence or sexual assault in the US? Like, is that something that's talked about there or not?
I mean, I guess it depends, because I know that, like, people in my family have continued to stay in relationships that, like, have been violent, and they're citizens now of the US, but they still continue with that, like, idea that, like, you just get one pick and you have to stay there. But
I think it definitely depends on, like, what are all the different factors. It definitely depends on your economic status, because that affects, like, what kind of resources you have.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you're from, like, a wealthier background, it's a little bit, I don't know, though. It's like a swing thing. It's, like, in the middle. There's, like, I feel like there's starting to become a more accepted attitude toward it of, like, you should feel safe to come forward and get the help that you need and get the, you know, the legal repercussions kind of happening. That wasn't really good English. But then it's, like, on either side of, like, I feel like super wealthy and, like, super poor, it's, like, highly discouraged to, like, talk about things. And I would say it's also different depending on, like, your race. Like, I can't speak to anything other than, like, white families, because I'm white. But I think a lot of the families that I know, it's very, like, not isolated, but it's very much like something that you would just talk about with like the people that you know. It's not something that you would really share.
Mm-hmm.
And when it is shared, it's because it's like so horrific that you like need to kind of get it out there so that like the legal stuff gets fixed. But I think also like, yeah, there's like the economic, there's race stuff.
There's also immigration status, because
yeah.
I know that maybe it'll say like 1 out of 10 women in the U.S., but that's not counting those who are immigrants and are too afraid to say something.
Yeah.
Because they might get like deported or whatever.
And I'm sure it probably happens even more frequently for those populations because you know that they won't report it.
Yeah.
Or that there won't be consequences for you because of like legal status. I think there is like, I almost feel like there's starting to become a trend where it's like, well, don't ignore that like men are also sexually assaulted. Like that's on the rise as well, where it's like it's almost normal now for like women to come forward, but now it's like, okay, well now we need to encourage men as well, because obviously it does happen to men, but so that's interesting too.
Are there any like initiatives or like victims of abuse? Like what resources or support services are there available in the US? Like, I don't know, shelters, counseling, or hotlines, something like that?
I think there is health lines and counseling centers. I guess I can't think of any.
It definitely depends on where you live. I think cities or like urban centers will have way more access to like shelters and like immediately accessible like medical resources, but I would imagine that like, you know, if you live out where we live, like here, that like it's more rural, there's not as much like, it's more community dependent as opposed to like you could go out and find a shelter, or you could go to like, you could leave somewhere and like find a safe place, or like be able to report it and have it be somewhat anonymous. And I think that's another aspect of it, is like if you're in a rural community, you probably know all of the people, or you know a lot of them more than you would if you lived in a city, and that probably affects like how people get resources, or like even what kind of resources they have.
And like yourself as women, do you trust in the public institutions like the state to do something in that hypothetical case that you were to suffer, I don't know, any type of violence, gender related, in the future? Like, do you have that trust in the public institutions?
I want to say yes. I feel like our answers are going to be different.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would say no.
But I think it would definitely depend on where I am.
Yeah.
Like, I think at Kenyon, if something happened to me here, I do have faith in the school environment, that if I went to somebody and I said, this happened to me, that something would get done about it. But I also know that I grew up, like, my mom endured, like, some pretty horrific, like, sexual abuse from a stepfather in her life, and then was, like, relatively ignored and, like, just kind of, you know, like, she's still dealing with a lot of that. So I grew up in an environment that was very much, like, if something happens to you, you speak up right away. Like, don't try to protect anybody, it's not worth it. So I feel like I would have the capacity to like self-advocate in order to make sure that something happened, but not every woman grows up in that environment. In fact, I would say a lot of women don't. So I think it would look different if I was like at home in California and something happened. I feel like I'd be less willing to kind of try and get something done about it.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I feel kind of the opposite way, of where I feel like because the school is so predominantly, like, not to bring race in, but predominantly white, it genuinely feels like, not that they wouldn't care, but that they would, like, lessen the care, versus, like, if I went home, like, I know if I told my parents, like, they would be the ones to take more action on it.
The statistics gathered by INEC and other entities like UN Women show that the efforts reported by the government in the 2020 Voluntary National Review have been insufficient to eradicate the various forms of violence against women in Ecuador. Although some regulatory advances have been made, the structural and institutional violence affecting women and girls in the country goes beyond legal texts, requiring the state to adopt additional measures to address this issue. Moreover, public policy on violence against women lacks coherence and comprehensiveness. On one hand, national plans have been created to address this issue, but on the other, the budget required by state institutions to implement these plans has been cut. The state has also failed to adopt an intersectional approach to address gender violence holistically, leaving different communities more vulnerable to various forms of violence. Achieving gender equality and empowering women in Ecuador must be a priority that calls for comprehensive and inclusive policies that take human rights and gender into account.